Rubru means face-to-face in the Urdu language. If you are a Muslim, the Rubru FTF series can help you find your bearings on where Muslims stand today in relation to their recent past. All viewers may find many of the misconceptions floating around, corrected by the information the Rubru FTF series supplies. DMSA stands for Do Muslims Still Regress? West's journey to enlightenment is frequently discussed in relation to Muslims' recent past and present. Therefore, it needs to be revisited in relation to our basic theme. DMSR 4.3 presents a brief summary of European Renaissance, Enlightenment and colonial exploitation. The European Middle Ages, roughly between 476 and 1500, is recognized as a period of decline and stagnation. The changes in European thought that started at the end of this period have been given the name of Renaissance, a French word meaning rebirth. Technical advances like the printing press, scientific discoveries like Copernicus' heliocentric solar system, and new developments in education, arts, and culture appeared in this period. The term Renaissance is used to designate a historical period of cultural revival that began in the late 14th century in Italy and spread throughout Europe and beyond. It is considered to be a predecessor of the Age of Reason. Europe's exposure to the outside world helped it start a process to step out of the Dark Ages. Islamic countries kept many classical Greek and Roman texts that had been lost in Europe, and they were reintroduced through returning crusaders. Philip van Ness Myers, in his book Medieval and Modern History, observes that many agencies conspired to bring in Renaissance. Among these were the Crusades. Robert Briffault, in his The Making of Humanity, observes that it was under the influence of the Arabian and Moorish revival of culture, and not in the 15th century, that the real Renaissance took place. Spain, not Italy, was the cradle of the rebirth of Europe. After steadily sinking lower and lower into barbarism, it had reached the darkest depths of ignorance and degradation when cities of the Saracenic world, Baghdad, Cairo, Cordova, and Toledo, were growing centers of civilization and intellectual activity. It was there that the new life arose, which was to grow into a new phase of human evolution. From the time when the influence of their culture made itself felt, began the stirring of a new life. The fact has been set forth again and again, but it has been nevertheless stubbornly ignored and persistently minimized. The debt of Europe to the heathen dog could, of course, find no place in the scheme of Christian history, and the garbled falsification has imposed itself on all subsequent conceptions. Recent research has pointed out a close link between the intellectual advancements of the early Renaissance period and the scientific material brought into Europe from the Middle East. George Selber, in his article entitled Whose Science is Arabic Science in Renaissance Europe, documents extensive details of the influence of Middle Eastern material on intellectual work taken up during the Renaissance. A typical example would be the established key Renaissance figure, Copernicus. The mathematical edifice of Copernican astronomy could not have been built, as it was finally built, by just using the mathematical information available in such classical Greek mathematical and astronomical works as Euclid's Elements and Ptolemy's Almagest. What was needed, and was in fact deployed by Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, himself, was the addition of two new mathematical theorems. Both of those theorems were first produced some 3 centuries before Copernicus, and were used by astronomers working in the Islamic world for the express purpose to reform Greek astronomy. The Renaissance changed the European worldview and thought. The most significant changes that emerged as a result of the Renaissance can be seen in European architecture, art, literature, mathematics, music, philosophy, politics, religion, and science. It eventually led to the major events of the Age of Reason. Following the Renaissance, the 17th century is supposed to have initiated the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. Centuries of tradition and custom were set aside in favor of exploration, individualism, tolerance, and scientific advancement. The Age of Reason is the period of rigorous scientific, political, and philosophical discourses that continue today. The journey to the Age of Reason was a time of unprecedented intellectual progress and social upheaval. It combined views on humanity, nature, reason, and God into a worldview that found acceptance in the West in the 18th to 20th centuries. Central to Enlightenment thought were the use and celebration of reason, the power by which humans understand the universe and improve their own condition. The goals of rational humanity were considered to be knowledge, freedom, and happiness. The revolutionary thought of many individuals set the wheels of progressive thinking in motion. The Enlightenment was both a movement and a state of mind. The term represents a phase in the intellectual history of Europe, but it also serves to define programs of reform in which influential literati, inspired by a common faith in the possibility of a better world, outline specific targets for criticism and proposals for action. The special significance of the Enlightenment lies in its combination of principle and pragmatism. The Renaissance challenged Christianity's hold on society, which was further weakened by the Enlightenment. The method of reason was applied to religion itself, and the Enlightenment produced secularized theories covering ethics, psychology, and social organizations. The Enlightenment thought had two distinct lines. The radical line sought the eradication of religious authority, while the moderate line advocated accommodation between reform and faith. Trust in reason, however, laid the foundation for modern, rational, and democratic societies. Innovation and change were accelerated. Science has played a dominant role in Enlightenment thought. The method that initiated the Enlightenment was also applied to the fields of law, economics, social sciences, and politics. Influential ideas of the Enlightenment included opposition to absolute monarchy, separation of powers across different branches of government, liberty and individual rights, equality, and free market capitalism. The Enlightenment led people to envision the relationship between people and the state as a social contract, rather than a relationship between the ruler and the subjects. An approach to improvement through fact-based reason and inquiry reshaped the way liberty, equality, and individual rights were treated. The Enlightenment expresses itself in the current notions of free speech and in secular yet religiously tolerant societies. This profound movement has transformed the nature of society forever. The European 30 Years' War ended with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which curbed the tendency for colonization within Europe. However, after this achievement, Europe continued with its greatest colonization in human history in the rest of the world. The colonization of the non-European world paralleled the trajectory of the Renaissance and Enlightenment within Europe. History records the ventures of military leaders and kings who united tribes and societies to dominate other nations and control their material and human resources. However, the colonialism of recent history stands out as the only example where societies were motivated by greed, hitherto exclusive to the kings, and developed control over others' resources at a level not witnessed in human history before. Spurred by technological advances during the Renaissance and Enlightenment, European societies had the resources to pursue their insatiable lust for world resources and tried to explain it, as some of it is still being explained, with implausible justifications. In the words of Edward Said, the foundational figure in post-colonial studies, the argument, when reduced to its simplest form, was clear. It was precise, it was easy to grasp. There are Westerners, and there are Orientals. The former dominate, the latter must be dominated, which usually means having their land occupied, their internal affairs rigidly controlled, and their blood and treasure put at the disposal of one or another Western power. The extent of colonialism at its height in the early 20th century is reflected in Edward Said's observation. By 1914, Europe held a grand total of roughly 85% of the earth as colonies, protectorates, dependencies, dominions, and commonwealths. No other associated set of colonies in history was as large, none so totally dominated, none so unequal in power to the Western metropolis. Resistance to colonial control involved phenomenal struggle in the Muslim world. The seminal work of Edward Said, particularly his groundbreaking book Orientalism, 1978, has garnered immense recognition worldwide, profoundly influencing fields such as literature, post-colonial studies, cultural studies, history, and political science. It has become a foundational text in critical theory, taught in universities worldwide, and cited in a vast array of scholarly work. He extensively explored how Western superiority was imposed on the minds of the colonized. He argued that Western discourses constructed an image of the Orient as backward and inferior, thereby justifying the colonial domination. In his words, Orientalism was a political vision of reality whose structure promoted the difference between the familiar West, us, and the strange Orient, the them. He articulated the processes through which the West imposed a sense of its own superiority onto the colonized, shaping not only the external representation of the Orient, but also how the colonized came to see themselves, often internalizing these imposed notions of inferiority. Decolonizing the mind is a concept popularized by Ngugi wa Thiong'o of Kenya in his book, Decolonizing the Mind. According to him, imperialism is total. It has economic, political, military, and psychological consequences for the people of the world today. The oppressed and the exploited of the earth maintain their defiance. The biggest weapon wielded and actually unleashed daily by imperialism against that collective defiance is the cultural bomb. It makes them see their past as one wasteland of non-achievement and makes them want to distance themselves from that wasteland. The legacy of colonialism that still shapes the production, dissemination, and validation of knowledge is being studied and questioned all around the world. Research undertaken by scholars shows how Western epistemologies have marginalized non-Western perspectives and knowledge systems. There is a need to reconstruct and reimagine knowledge, identity, history, and reality from a decolonial perspective. An original view, free from narratives floating around and based purely on facts, can lead us to realistic conclusions.